Hello, I am Professor Kate Antonova, and I am here to talk to students about my book, which I assume if you're watching this, it's because you've been assigned it. It's called The Essential Guide to Writing History Essays, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about what it can do for you, and hopefully why it was assigned to you, why it's different than you might be thinking when you're assigned a book about writing and you've seen some things like that before and they have not been helpful, and it's just one more thing to buy, one more thing to read. It's just too much, right? So I wrote this to not be that. I teach history primarily. My classes are frequently writing intensive or specifically about methods, but I also teach regular history. My specialty happens to be Russian history, European history. But I have found in my kind of lost count now, about 15 years of teaching at Queens College at the City University of New York, that there was nothing I could assign my students that I felt was worth the money and that would actually be helpful. I am particularly picky because I was trained as a graduate student in composition studies, which is the study of how to teach and learn writing. So I knew what it could be and should be. That kind of field is overwhelmingly dominated by people in English departments. The thing is, history is just as much about writing as literature is. We read almost exclusively texts, although we also can look at objects and so on. And images, especially a lot, but we still read tons and tons of text, and we write. Everything that we produce is written. So writing is just as much at the core of the discipline as it is for English, yet for kind of reasons not worth going into, boring institutional kind of reasons mainly, and because of the relatively recent composition studies literature only got started in the early 90s. It's relatively recent. It's not formally a part of most historians' training. It's not formally a part of most history curricula, although that is absolutely changing, and hopefully you're at a place, maybe you've been assigned this book because you're at a place where that emphasis is really being put explicitly into the curriculum, and if that's the case, then that's great news. It might not seem like great news to you yet, but I promise it will be. So anyway, I had this extra experience. I couldn't find anything out there that I could assign, so I was creating my own handouts to provide what my students needed, and eventually the number of handouts reached such a point that it became publishable as a book, revised obviously, but so that's the book. One thing I want to get out of the way is I'm not here to sell you the book. For one thing, you should know that it sells for $25 in paperback, and I get about $1 for every new paperback copy sold. Less for ebooks. Hardcovers don't get sold except to libraries. Nobody would pay that. That would be ridiculous. But so, in other words, the costs go to Oxford University Press, and it costs them an enormous amount to produce a book, editing and printing and all of those things. So I'm not getting rich off of this. That's not the purpose. I am a full professor, so I have a salary. 75% of teaching faculty in the United States are not full-time at all. They're called adjuncts or some version of adjuncts, and they're paid literally poverty wages, with no benefits, no office. They're paid only for credit hour of being in front of students in a classroom. They're not paid for preparing or grading or meeting with students or other things that are considered essential to the job that they must do, but they're not paid for them, and no benefits. That is 75% of the faculty you see teaching in classrooms. I always want to make a really big point of that. I'm a rare exception out of pure luck. That my timing happened to be good and I got on a tenure track and I've made it through the hoops and I'm now a full professor. That means I have a salary. That means I am not doing this to get rich. I'm not on YouTube to make money. I'm here to hopefully reach some students and hopefully convince you to actually open up the book and use it. This is a book to be used more than read. It is a book to refer to as needed, not to read through from cover to cover. So I want to give you a sense of what's in here and what can be useful to you about it. First thing you might notice is there are these tabs. I've put these in my copy because I need to be able to refer to some key bits in class frequently, and I want to be able to jump right to them. I would recommend you do the same when you find something especially helpful. Part of the idea of the book is that it should help you in every history class you take, whether gen ed required history classes that you take regardless of your major, or especially, of course, for history majors. This is also, I'll have a separate video about using this book for graduate students. That's kind of a separate issue. I'm mainly speaking about undergraduates right now. And this is pretty much specific to the United States and Canada. British undergraduate education, higher education is quite different. It's a different system, particularly different nomenclature. So while it might be useful, you would have to put some more work into adapting it to the nomenclature that's used where you are. If you're in a foreign university outside of North America or the UK, especially non-English speaking university, it might be useful as a text on what American academic standards are, which are generally, at the moment, for the time being, considered kind of an international standard. And some of you who may be thinking about, for example, graduate school in the United States might find it useful. But mainly, I'm really talking about American and Canadian undergraduates. So one of the first big differences about this book compared to others is that it's not just how to write a research essay. The vast majority of books on how to write that are specific to history are on how to write a research essay. Now, research essays are important. It's the classic model of how history is written. It's just a model. It's not exactly the same, but it is a sort of miniature version of, sorry, the birds are very loud. I'm in my yard. It's a miniature version of the published article or book that historians write as our main product, right? That's the main thing that we produce out of our research. And it is a sort of miniature version of that. In my history major at Queen's College, for example, we don't systematically require a long research essay of 10 or more pages until the senior capstone essay. It's also the first time our history majors, years ago, were getting formal instruction in writing, other than that the college in general required a freshman comp for all majors, and there was occasional writing intensive courses, and various history profs emphasize writing more than others and bring it into the classroom more than others. So it's not like they got nothing, but they didn't get a sort of formal required, this is how we write in the history field, until the senior essay. And when I was teaching that class, they would say, wow, this is really great, but why didn't we get this at the beginning of the major? So that was one of my big concerns. The other concern is that what about all those other classes before the senior essay when you're asked more than anything else to write a primary source essay? That's the kind of classic undergraduate assignment. It's classic for a lot of reasons. Primary sources are the evidence of our field, so we really want students to be able to see the evidence firsthand, to grapple with the evidence firsthand. We tend to make them sort of short essays where you look at one, maybe compare two primary sources, and just try to understand them as closely as you can. That's your sort of most basic primary source essay, because they're difficult and they're key because that's our evidence, but they're also written often in old-fashioned language. They're not written for students. They're written, in the past at some point for an audience at the time. And part of what you have to figure out is who was that intended audience? Who is this person who wrote it? What time and place was it? What do we know about that time and place that informs the primary source? Those are the very first, most important methods of what historians do. We study evidence, and our evidence is not data. Our evidence is not the result of experimentation or the scientific method. Our evidence is not literature, which has, plot and story and some formal elements that are usually fairly consistent. Our evidence is anything from the past. That's why it can be things other than text. It can be objects, it can be images, it can be anything. Primarily we look at text, but even the kind of text we looked at, it could be fiction, historical novels, i.e. written a long time ago, right? Or short stories or whatever. Any kind of fiction written at the time we're studying would be a primary source evidence for a historian. But also government documents, letters and diaries, speeches, essays of any kind written by some time. Literally anything that comes from the time we're studying is a primary source. That means that if you're studying evidence, you have so many different kinds of evidence to deal with. We tend to ask some of the same questions about any kind of evidence. Who wrote it? What was the time and place they wrote it in? What was the intended audience? What are they trying to say? What's between the lines? What can we use about whatever we know about the larger context to understand the document better? And by document, I mean very loosely, literally anything from the past. It doesn't have to be literal text. And also, of course, what can this document tell us about the time and place? And that's usually the main thing we're getting at, right? We use this as evidence to understand not literally what happened in the past, but cause and effect. What caused changes? When were the changes? What causes those changes? What are the effects of those changes when there are continuities or sort of a lack of change? Why is that? These are the kinds of questions historians are asking, right? And hopefully those documents will reflect on them. That's a much more basic move before you get to a long argumentative-based research essay where you're constructing an argument about the past, about cause and effect in the past. Before you can get there, you have to understand the evidence. So usually what we assign a lot in classes are these primary source essays. That's not the only earlier sort of assignment we do. Often you will get, as I'm sure you know, response papers or any kind of reading response where we're mainly kind of trying to make sure you do the reading, but also much more importantly, that you understood the reading. That's why we want to see it, right? To make sure that you're following what you're reading because primary sources, as I've said, can be really challenging. Also, if you're reading what historians have already written. Those are secondary sources. It's also can be quite, academic language is not always the most fun read, and it's not always the easiest read, and also it can involve specialized terms that are difficult to know and everything. So you need to practice both of those things. So when we sometimes have you write response papers, we're asking you to practice reading and responding to the reading to show your understanding of that reading and to actually create the understanding of the reading. Ideally, a response paper is not just a place where you record what you learned from it. Oh, now we have loud airplanes. No, it's a helicopter. Sorry. You not only are sort of recording what you understood, but the act of writing, of forcing yourself to coherently, in full sentences that anyone can understand, explain in your own words what you read. That process is actually in itself learning. It's not just reporting. Having to rewrite something in your own words, especially complicated stuff, forces your brain to actually understand it clearly. If you're going to write your own coherent sentences, ideally, right, you have to understand it well, and you're going to remember it better. So that act itself is an act of learning. So we often require those. There's also, of course, exams. And history exams are often and ideally written exams. You might also get multiple choice quizzes, weekly quizzes, the occasional midterm or final of that format, depending on your university and department and how they operate. But generally speaking, a lot of large-scale assessments or exams will be written in history. And traditionally, a lot of times, an individual professor will get imaginative, but for the most part, the kind of standard, what typically happens is that you'll get some combination of IDs, as they're known, or short identification essays. That's what an ID stands for. And longer essays. These can be called a lot of things. I call it an analytical essay. It's some kind of longer, a few pages written at home if it's an at-home exam, or filling a blue book if you're in a classroom, or the equivalent of a blue book, in response to some prompt. You're usually given what's called a prompt. That's because sometimes it's not as simple as a question. It wouldn't be as simple as sort of, what caused World War I? Although it could be. It would be, historian X says this, historian Y says that. Take a stand on who you agree with, which could be both or neither, and defend your stance. These are the sort of take a stand essays. And that's because taking a stand means constructing an argument. And that is, after understanding the evidence, the next major thing historians do is use that evidence to support an argument that answers some big question of cause and effect over time. That's, in short, exactly what we do, right? So in an exam essay, short identification essays are to say, you understand what this thing was. They're usually about a paragraph, 4 to 5 sentences. Typically, you'll be given just a word or a phrase or a concept. You have to ID it, identify it, define it, explain it. And that always includes why is it important, so that you can show you know it. Then there's this essay thing with a prompt that is asking you to construct an argument or, as they say, take a stand on some issue, right? A lot of you will have done similar things in high school already. The thing is, partly because you've probably done a lot of those primary source essays also, you may either already be getting pretty good grades and think, yeah, I know how to do that. I've done that several times. It's working out, right? Or you've done it and it doesn't go so well and you don't really know why, and you're starting to think, or maybe firmly convinced yourself by now, that you're bad at it. Neither is actually true. Any academic writing is a learned skill. Some people may seem to be naturally better at it. That would be either because they've had more practice, and most likely number one reason people seem to be naturally better at it is simply they read a lot and or grew up in an environment where that kind of language and reasoning was common. Children of professors, for example. Those kind of people can seem really good at things. And for example, I was not the children of professors at all, but I was a reader, and I had read everything I could get my hands on for a really long time. So when I was in high school and college, I would just get papers back with an A on it and not know how or why it was good. And actually looking back, they weren't very good essays. What they were good imitations of a good essay. And frankly, a lot of educators are so overwhelmed and are working really hard with the students who most need help. And so the students who are producing something that looks like what needs to be produced, just get an A and walk out the door, right? This was actually the source of how I got interested in all of this, is I wanted to understand if my writing was succeeding in the sense of meeting its goals, right? And my goal would not be the A so much as actually communicating a thought or learning something and then communicating it, right? Ideally. Often I felt I wasn't learning anything in the process. I would feel like I actually turned in some crap that was incoherent, and I was getting A's back on some of that. And that was deeply unsatisfying. And I know, yeah, feel sorry for me. Yeah, right. But the issue was I did actually want to know stuff. I did actually want to learn. And ideally, we should all do that. That's part of the fun of life. It's part of living a full life. And I wanted to know what that would actually look like. It's surprising how hard that was to find, even going to a frankly very elite and very hardcore college that I went to. Nonetheless, it was hard. However, by being at the University of Chicago, where I happened to go for undergrad, I was able to find the one course that blew my mind open and has been essential really to the rest of my life. It was a writing course. It's colloquially known as the Little Red Schoolhouse at the University of Chicago. It started out as a course for business people, actually, on how to communicate more clearly. It was started by a guy named Joseph Williams, who studied literature and writing and reading and all of those things. And he was right there in the early 90s when composition studies began, when scholars first started to research how does the human brain actually process text? What makes one sentence clearer than the other? We had been sort of depending on, a reader saying, this is clear, this is not clear. When in fact, so what do you do tell a potential writer then? How do you learn how to write? Say, be clear. And that's frankly what a lot of the published books you've probably been assigned before say, be clear. Like you would not do that on purpose. Like, of course you're trying to be clear. The point, right, is how. So these scholars in the early 90s were researching, including using MRIs, how does the human brain actually process language? How do English speakers process the English language specifically? What kinds of word order? What kinds of ordering of paragraphs and flow and so on? Topic sentences, all that kind of stuff. What makes one sentence clearer than another, one essay clearer than another? We know now, and it is teachable. It is absolutely teachable. This is partly why freshman comp is now required in most universities. You may be thinking, yeah, I took freshman comp. It wasn't all that helpful. Here's the thing about freshman comp or freshman composition, sort of how to write. It is very much, by intention, interdisciplinary, meaning it is meant to distill the fundamentals of academic writing for any discipline, the things that they all have in common, the lowest common denominator of academic writing, and drill it into every kind of student, regardless of their potential paths or interests or whatever, right? One of the biggest problems with it is because everyone needs to take it. You need huge armies of people. In other words, there's enormous demand for faculty to teach it. Universities don't want to pay that much faculty. And I know you're thinking, oh my God, tuition has gone so high. There's so much money going into colleges. Why can't they pay super qualified, wonderful faculty to teach these? They choose not to. There's plenty of faculty out there. The supply is very much available. You may have heard there's an oversupply. Actually, the supply about meets the demand. But universities choose to allocate the money towards facilities, administrative salaries, hugely into sports and those kinds of programs, which the argument is they bring in more money, into the facilities for the hard sciences, which I'm not going to argue with that. That's absolutely valuable. I'll just point out that humanities and social sciences that are so much denigrated actually bring in money because we don't need any of that stuff. All we need is a room, right? And our faculty are very much underpaid compared to our STEM colleagues. And every single student in those rooms brings in tuition. In the sciences, they actually need to get outside grants in addition to college money, often much more of the outside grant than the institution's money for those really expensive facilities of labs and so on. And all of the other things required, including computers and other devices and software and all that stuff, right? That they're actually a net loss for the university. Now it's a required net loss. We're not going to not have STEM, right? We need that. I'm not arguing with that at all. I'm just kind of pointing out how money is allocated around a university system. And in any case, part of the reason why is this incredibly high tuition not going to, say, well-paid or at least decently paid instructors, good qualified instructors to teach freshman comp, is that most of the university's funds actually came from the public. For most universities, I'm not talking about Harvard and Yale here, but I'm talking about the vast majority of colleges and universities in the United States. That public funding has been gradually taken away by voters, starting in the late 60s when there were a lot of scandals on college campuses. A lot of people were unhappy with it. Increasingly, colleges and universities have diversified. It's no longer sort of a path and a guarantee of success for the white middle class that it was starting after World War II with the GI Bill and so on. It became more open to more people, which is a good thing. But that has scared off a lot of the public and voters. And there's been also, frankly, just propaganda, just lies about how the universities work and that they're brainwashing and so on. And I'll just say this. If I could brainwash you to do the reading, That's what I would brainwash you to do above anything else. But I can't even achieve that most of the time. So I just find that concept hilarious. Anyway, so for all of these reasons, we don't need to get further into the people who end up teaching freshman comp are adjuncts. Now, adjuncts are often the best qualified faculty in the country, largely because they tend to be younger, and the people who have gotten PhDs later have the more recent experiences, and that includes often actually training graduate students in pedagogy and how to teach writing. That has been very, very late. It was just beginning when I was in grad school, and I was part of that process, and it has gotten a little bit better at some places since. It's still very much not what it should be, but later you've been in it, the more you would have of that kind of background. But also the main thing is the job market has been so unbelievably bad since the 70s. That's when it really tanked. There's been a few bleeps of relief and a huge, most recent nosedive since 2008. But it's basically been abysmal since the 70s. That means for PhDs finishing, they have to continually achieve more and more and more and more and more to even have a chance at a full-time job. So our more recent PhDs, for example, may go on the job market with a book already out and several articles when the people on the search committee who are senior scholars interviewing them have never even achieved that much. And that's now a common case. So I don't want to put down adjuncts. Adjuncts are often our best teachers. They're also by far our most experienced teachers because they, in order to even get close to a living on adjunct pay, are teaching many, many sections, often at different colleges and universities. They may teach, for example, my load, which is a pretty heavy load for full-time faculty, is 3 courses per semester. Adjuncts sometimes teach 4 or 5 or even more. Many faculty at large public universities and community colleges regularly teach 4 at a time, but that's about the maximum for full-time faculty. Adjuncts are often doing more than that. So the thing is, if your only experience of the system is to take one freshman comp class that was taught by an adjunct who was teaching 6 classes at 3 different campuses, not paid for preparation, not paid for grading, not paid for meeting with students, not even given an office, none of us get parking spaces generally, that person may actually be better than anyone else at the university at teaching writing, but they can't. They're literally, taken out at the knees from actually being able to teach effectively. So that's one of the big problems with freshman comp. Sorry, it's such a long and depressing story, but that's a fact, and I find it really important to make sure students are aware of this and what's kind of going on behind the scenes. The other part is just that it's so interdisciplinary. It's very, very general, and that is on purpose again. So what we do in history department, for example, is build on your freshman comp. Ideally, a lot of times the expectation is just, oh, you took freshman comp, you know how to write. And then when you don't meet the standards expected that are very specific to history, for example, a history primary source essay may look a lot like a literature essay reading a novel and analyzing that novel. We may ask you to read a novel and analyze it, and you're thinking, oh, that's the same kind of paper, I know what I'm doing. The questions we ask are totally different. The ways of looking at the evidence are totally different. The kinds of evidence we're looking for in that text are totally different. So then you could get a low grade and say either my professor's crazy or my freshman comp class was bad, but clearly something's awful here. And it may lead you to sort of give up or to think that, every course is about pleasing the professor, which is not true. I'll have another video about that. But, and from the perspective of many history faculty who don't have the background and training any more than you do, they would say, well, that freshman comp seems to be taught incompetently. It's terrible. My students come in, they should know how to write. They've taken freshman comp and they can't produce primary source essay, the most basic thing, right? Well, you haven't been taught that yet. We need to teach you that in the history department because it is specific to the discipline of history. So all of these issues are the reason I wrote this book, right? And the reason I want this book to be in your hands. So there's a chapter on the short identification essay, 1 paragraph, a whole chapter on how to actually do that effectively. And that means not just telling you to be clear. It tells you what clear looks like. And throughout the entire book, I give you examples, not of the ideal to try to live up to, which I find not only intimidates students, but it encourages what I always did as a student, which is sort of copying, just kind of dressing up, almost putting a costume on of the kind of writer I've read. And so I'm writing maybe about a different subject, but I make it sound like what I've read before. And that can, as I said, be fairly successful. It's just not satisfying. You're not actually learning. So let's aim for better, right? And what I'm trying to do is to show you how to do that. I'm showing you why an ID essay exists. Every single chapter for every kind of assignment in this book begins with what's your goal, because every different kind of assignment has a different goal. You're not just writing a thing on topic X. That's often how we talk about history papers. Write a paper on say Malcolm X, because X is in my mind, right? What that leads to is what we call sort of a book report or a third grade paper. And sometimes, this is not something I approve of, but some faculty will even say that in feedback, which just sounds incredibly insulting. What they're struggling to articulate and failing to articulate in a particularly rude way is that we have different goals. Our goals at higher education level, at college level, are analytical. You should be doing some level of analysis in any form of writing you do. Simply summarizing only, unless you're specifically asked only to do that as some kind of preliminary assignment, working towards something more. Simply summarizing, which you may have done a lot of, hopefully did do a lot of, through grade school, middle school, and high school, right? Because that's an important skill. We expect you to have mastered the ability to summarize at this point. Now, not everybody has, and there's some work to do on that as well, and that's covered in the book also. But we're going to ask you to summarize and demonstrate the significance. Summarize and respond. Summarize and then use as support in service of an argument is ultimately where we're going, right? So that's the expectation. So if you stop at summarizing, yes, that's not adequate for what you're doing, but you should be told that. What often happens, and this was the way my own education went, and this was the way pretty much all the faculty you're going to meet were educated as well, is that you're asked to do a thing, you do the thing, and then you get feedback. And sometimes that feedback says great with no comments, and sometimes it's some version of not so great with some comments. And I've seen, every faculty member has seen students throw those away on their way out the door without even looking at them. Faculty get very frustrated because they put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into those comments. That entire system is wrong. It's so backward and wrong. It's very traditional. It is so automatically understood as the way things work in education that very few people have ever even considered questioning it. But it's bad and wrong. I'm here to say it's bad and wrong. What we should be doing instead is teaching you how to do the thing. What is the thing we're even trying to do? Not a paper on X if we want something analytical. That does not cover it, right? How do you analyze X? To what end? What part of it are we trying to analyze, and to find out what? That's the key part, right? What are we trying to find out if we're doing some analysis? We can't just say, yeah, write on Malcolm X and give me some analysis. Unfortunately, that's very common instructions, and it's terrible, and it's not your fault, and it's something that shouldn't happen. I also don't blame the faculty who do it, because frankly, they've never been taught otherwise either. But I am trying to kind of lead a crusade here against that, and I'm not the only one. There's other people on the same side. We're all in this together in a crusade. Not all of us, but many of us are in this crusade. What should happen is we teach you what the expectations are, starting with the goal. So every chapter starts with, what is the goal of this kind of assignment? We are seeking a different end goal with a short ID on an exam than we are with a primary source essay or a capstone research essay for your BA thesis, right? Those each have different goals. And those goals tell you what you need to do, what should be on paper, what makes one more effective than another. And there's no such thing as good writers or bad writers, or a good paper or a bad paper. There are papers that are more effective at meeting that goal and papers that are less effective at meeting that goal. And there are students who have learned how to write effectively, and there are students who are still working on that path, right? But everybody has to learn it. Even if you're learning it sort of by being around it and by constantly correcting yourself, that is the least efficient and most painful way to learn. There's always a better way. There's a way to learn where you're actually realizing what you're learning and can then be self-aware enough of your skills to apply it in new ways, but also to write using your own voice rather than copying what sounds like good writing, which has often actually become so kind of false and formulaic and empty. It's not actually all that good. And I definitely say that a lot of my writing before I was properly trained. To really express yourself within the boundaries of a genre you're working in, which may be academic writing in this case, and that genre imposes certain constraints. But within those constraints can be creativity, but also expression. And ultimately, that's what we want to do. We can only do that if we're in control of our tools, if we know what the tools are, if we know what makes one sentence clearer than another, but also what makes a sentence graceful, what makes a sentence more easily convince a reader of one argument rather than another, which is often what we're sort of getting to, not to sort of brainwash anyone, but to hopefully defend a just case. In other words, to present evidence faithfully, as we would hope the sort of ideal of the most ethical lawyer in the world would present a case in a courtroom to defend a client who, say, has been wrongfully accused or something, and to to let that truth prevail, right? That's ultimately, let's hope, in an ideal world, what an ethical scholar is trying to do. We're not trying to do what, say, one of the most interesting writers to me is Leon Trotsky. He's a fantastic writer, incredibly skilled. What he was trying to do was lead a revolution. So, not commenting on the goals of the revolution or any of that. That's for another course. I do teach Russian history. I can do another video on that. But what's fascinating from a writing point of view is Trotsky constantly uses this one particular trick, sort of one cool trick, YouTube style, right, of starting sentences with obviously, comma, blah, blah, blah. Of course, comma, blah, blah, blah. That is a rhetorical trick to tell the reader that you should already know this. So if you didn't already know it, you're like, oh, yeah, of course I knew that, because it's a sort of human response to be like, oh, yeah, I'm with the smart people I'm following. I'm right on it with you. Or to make it seem like the statement that follows is, in fact, obvious, when what usually followed those kinds of sentences for Trotsky was something totally not obvious, something that actually needed to be defended and explained. He would just present it as if it were obvious, and that rhetorical trick often works on audiences. So in scholarly writing, for example, we want to not do that. It is part of the ethics of scholarly writing to avoid things like that, because we're supposed to use actual evidence and be very transparent about how we use our evidence in order to convince our audience. That's just an example of the ways that words work, affecting the actual content of our scholarship and also the ethics of our scholarship. All of that's intertwined. All of it comes together. And to learn history well, you have to not just be able to write clear sentences. You need to understand how writing works. You need to understand how communication works, how argumentation works, what makes something actually argumentative rather than simply summarizing, and all of those. So all of that's covered in the book. Another major issue I have had with previous books, and let me just quick do the basic one about money. One of my goals for this book was to make sure it was under $30. Unfortunately, our current publishing climate, I couldn't get it under $20, which is what I was really hoping for. But to get it as cheap as I could get it, and the ebook version is also out there. I think it's a little bit cheaper than the paperback. But the other sort of goal was to provide in one book all of the things you needed, because I don't know any faculty who have actually done this because it is such a ridiculous burden. Maybe you've met some who have. What's out there in the market before I wrote this book was books on how to write research essays, collections of like glossary of European history, for example, to give you the kind of specialized vocabulary that you need. Other materials, which are often more sort of available free online, but on how to read, that are often sort of, because they're free online, it's just like some professor wrote this up on a blog, and it's helpful, but it's often like someone in a different discipline, for example. It's not as polished as something that's, intended for publication. You'd have to cobble together a bunch of stuff from a bunch of different places. What I wanted to do all in one covers is everything. Oh, and grammar handbook, right? I like the Bedford Manual. It's really good. But can I force every student to buy that in addition to a book on research essays when they'll only write one research essay in their life if they're not going to pursue graduate school in history, which most don't? And the actual content books, right? The history books. I can't do that. I would never do that to my students at Queens College, and I don't think, frankly, anyone should do it to any college student. Books are ridiculously expensive. You have to buy enough of them as it is. And so I just don't want to contribute to that. So I wanted, if this book was going to be assigned, I wanted to include all of those things into one cover. So there are appendices at the end with very basic grammar reminders, also the kinds of things that are usually not covered, sort of conventions specific to history, like writing out World War II with Roman numerals, not the number 2, and other things that are specific. Ships going by she for some reason, but countries, no. Countries should be it. Don't call countries she anymore. It's a very old-fashioned thing, but it's gone. We don't do that anymore. Sort of what are the latest conventions on those kinds of things? All of that reference stuff is there. How to read effectively, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, for primary sources and secondary sources, because that's two different things, often not addressed in the sort of quickie free guides. Citation, not just how to do it, and not just the quick models to remember where to put the commas and the periods and the italics, but why citation actually exists. It's not just about stealing ideas. It's actually about much more than that almost never gets mentioned and is super important. That's all covered in the book. It's all here in one place. The other thing is, I wish, what part of it too, I hope each student can buy this book once and it would get them through every history class they ever take. Including those who actually do go into grad school and maybe even a PhD and eventually want to teach at the higher ed level like I do, that this would be how you learn to teach it, that it could do all of those things. And I believe that it can do that, but that's for another video. I would also kind of hope that because it's something a history major can use throughout the major, I hope that your departments would buy it for you. I'm just going to put that out into the world and hope that some departments think about it. Departments usually don't have a lot of money flowing around. But if there is a department fund that's, the kind of thing they use for pizza for the history club and stuff like that, if it could stretch to a copy of this book for the majors, that would be really nice. In any case, I hope that if you do have to buy it, it'll serve you in every course that you take. Okay, so another major reason, let's get to the reading thing. So like I said, there'll be these sort of short, free online guides. How do you essentially effectively skim a scholarly article? Where's the key information? Where to find the thesis? You've probably been told this before, right? The thesis is at the end of the introduction, generally speaking. And then a more elaborate version in the conclusion. And maybe you're already getting pretty efficient at skimming for that. Maybe this is new to you. In any case, that's step one in reading effectively. There's so much more to it. So if we just think about secondary sources, you're often given journal articles. We look for the most readable ones we can find. We don't always succeed. For your exposure to secondary sources as an undergraduate, to historians analyzing the past. That's what a secondary source is. You're very rarely given a whole monograph, at least at many institutions, because that's a lot to buy and a lot to read. And often we don't want just one voice to dominate a whole course, one historian to dominate the course. We want to give you a lot of conversation among different historians. It's really important pedagogically, learning-wise, for you to get exposure to different opinions, right? We're not actually trying to mind wash anyone. We want you to understand how history works. So we want different voices. The thing is, history is mainly monographs. That's primarily what historians write. And monographs, in some ways, are a larger version of an article. But in some ways, they're actually often more readable, partly because there's the kind of space to explain things fully. So they can be more accessible. But also, they really get into the depth of argument and evidence that an article can't do. So it is a tricky thing, but exposure to monographs is a good thing to the extent you get it. But it is then a different process of reading, and I'm not going to go into all the details here, but they're in the book of the differences between reading an article and a monograph, but also the differences between secondary sources like that, which are analytical texts written by historians where they're interpreting and arguing about evidence, right? That's different, obviously, from primary sources, which is the evidence itself, stuff written in the past, or stuff from the past. But there's another whole category you may not have even heard of, tertiary sources. Tertiary sources are the textbooks and encyclopedias, any kind of reference works. Those do not have argument in them. They are strictly summary for very specific educational purposes. Textbooks, obviously, you've, I'm sure, had too many history textbooks in your life already. They tend to be very dry because they are strictly, generally speaking, strictly summaries. If you're studying from a textbook or studying from a secondary source, those are two very different things. You're going to look for different things. You're going to find the important parts in different places. You want to take different kinds of notes to get the most out of those. You probably, if you've been assigned a textbook versus a secondary source, that's for a reason. You should understand what that reason is. All of that's covered here in the book. Also, primary sources, which are particularly difficult, like I said, because of old-fashioned vocabulary a lot, because it's not written for you, for a student or a sort of protege historian, as secondary sources are written for other historians involved in the research process, right? They're written for us, most of these secondary and tertiary sources. Primary sources were written by some person in the past, writing for reasons of their own 10, 50, 200, 500 years ago, right? Not expecting that we would read them. So it's very different as a reading task, and we look for things in an entirely different way. We ask entirely different questions. So I covered that in here. I also provide two sort of formal ways of taking notes, one for primary sources and one for secondary sources. There's also kind of separate advice on textbooks and lectures, taking notes on that. But a specific sort of form, like a worksheet, except actually useful, not the busy work you may have done at some point. But a sort of formal way of organizing notes on primary sources, asking certain questions specific to primary sources, separate one for secondary sources, asking the questions relevant only to secondary sources, so that you can systematically take the same kinds of notes on each thing. That's going to be way more helpful than randomly highlighting what may or may not be important, which tends to be all you're ever told to do. You're not even told to do that. You just sort of gather that's what other people do, and you're going to often find you're studying for an exam or looking for what you can use in your paper, just not ending up using the reading. Even if you struggled to stare at those pages for hours, you highlighted some random stuff. When you go to look for something for your paper, you won't know what you need. And unfortunately, often it's too common in history programs for you to not be taught otherwise. But I can teach you, and it's right here in the book, exactly what you're actually looking for. Write it down separately on one of these sheets And then when you need it for an exam, for the final paper or whatever, it's right there and you know what you need to use, and you can go, if you need specific quotes, go back and find them where you need them. So that's included in here. Also vocabulary. You will get hit with words like hegemonic. I remember hearing that in an undergraduate class, and everyone else in the class seemed to be nodding intelligently. I'm sure they were all thinking exactly what I was thinking, was what the hell is hegemonic? And I went and looked it up afterwards. But you're going to, part of the college experience is having a lot of new words thrown at you. Part of the experience is also looking them up, figuring out what they mean, and then applying that in your reading, and that's what you should do. But also, if we're teaching you history, there is no reason to have you go through that process in the least efficient and most painful way possible, like I said about sort of learning in general and writing in general. With vocabulary, there are a lot of terms that are particularly common in history. I can't possibly cover every term you're ever going to come across in your classes, and I can't replace the dictionary, right? But what I can do is note that there are some sets of words that are used constantly in history that you're unlikely to see elsewhere, or if you see them elsewhere, they're being used in a different way. Historians use them in a very particular way. Historicism, for example, is my favorite example. Historicism is a very different thing in literature or philosophy than it is in history. We almost never use it actually in history because we're, by definition, historicists. So there are certain words that we use in a very particular context where if you look them up in a dictionary, particularly Wikipedia, and I'm not going to argue against Wikipedia, but you should be aware not that it's sort of potential falsities, that's a whole thing, and it's all covered in the book, and I'm sure you've heard some lectures about that already. The big thing actually about Wikipedia or any other encyclopedia, whether crowd edited or not, is that it's going to give you general definition applicable in the broadest way, and then maybe list all the specific different definitions, maybe. But what it doesn't tell you is exactly how it's being used in our context. We're going to be using certain terms almost always in a very specific way within the discipline of history. And if you went and looked it up somewhere else, you might get a philosophical or other way of using it that doesn't actually make any sense in the context you're reading because it's being used in a different way. So what I have included in this book, along with the reading and the writing parts, is the vocabulary, including some help in pronunciation, by the way, because you should not feel stupid for saying Weber instead of Weber, or not knowing how to pronounce Begrüßgeschichte. Because, hello, but you're going to come across those words, right? So for one thing, my best advice is, it's forvo.com for foreign words, and it's how J say, like how I say, but with a J instead of I.com for pronunciations of virtually any word in the world, so you can sound smart. It's great. Anyway, there's whole sections in here on vocabulary specific to history that, I had to argue with my editor to include them. It's not actually that many pages, but I think adds one of the most important things to the book, and that's what I've heard from students too, adds one of the most important things to the book. So there's a few introductory chapters that explain some of what I've already told you about sort of what college is for, what history is for, what academic writing is, which think of academic writing as a foreign language. Nobody is natural to academic writing. It's not actually a spoken language at all, although some of us who read it constantly end up kind of talking like it. That's a bad habit because it doesn't work very well orally. It's a written language that communicates in a way that people can constantly refer to and use. That's part of the purpose. All of that is explained in here. And then what is history, which is often misunderstood? And I said it's the study of cause and effect over time, cause and of change and continuity, and the effects of change and continuity. That's what we study. It also sort of explains what a history major is for. If you're not going to pursue history in grad school, why be a history major? All kinds of reasons, and they're all explained in here. So that might be helpful. But beyond that sort of introductory chunk, which might be worth reading through at the beginning, the rest of this book you would use as needed. So there's a chapter on the short ID essay. There's a chapter on the reading response paper. There's a chapter on the exam style analytical essay with a prompt where you take a stand. There is a chapter on the kind of imaginative projects where, imagine you're George Washington and write letters from West Point or whatever, right? Sometimes you get those more fun ones on an exam, but it's also so open-ended it can be kind of intimidating. And on the one hand, it's a wonderful opportunity to be creative, and that's frankly why faculty assign it. We love to see your creativity, and it's really exciting. But how do you convey your understanding of the course that you also need for the grade, that we need to be able to justify that grade, right? That's often not always explained, and some people can kind of intuit it, but it shouldn't be that only the people who can happen to intuit it get the good grades, right? So that's explained. Then there's a section on the historiographical essay, which is one of those you might not be asked to do until quite late in a program or even grad school, except that historiographical essay, which sounds so fancy, is actually the same as a book review. A book review is a review of one book, right? A historiographical essay analyzes more than one secondary source. That's the only difference. Historiography is just a fancy word for literature reviews, how it's put in other disciplines. It's about reviewing one or more books. So you're actually quite often asked to do a book review, at least in the sort of more higher level history classes, not necessarily the general education ones. But in a history major, it's probably going to come up sooner or later. Then, of course, the primary source interpretation essay, the biggie, the one you've done a million times. How is it different from a literature reading of a piece of literature that you do for a literature class, right? It's totally different. And it maybe no one ever told you how and why. It's all here. There is an entire chapter on research using libraries, library databases, citation, why citation works the way it is, different citation styles, that they actually have a reason, not necessarily great reasons, but some reasons that can help you to remember the differences. But also, instead of giving you kind of just the latest Chicago style rules, which change every so often, I point you to the full thing. You can get the full thing from the Chicago Guide, or Turabian is the short version. I can point you to those things. But what I give you here is the reasoning behind citation, why and how it is done the way it's done, that helps you to actually remember it and understand the thinking and not just memorize it, although there's also the quick reminders for all the major source types so that you don't have to go look somewhere else. You can get it right here in this book, like I said. But also accepting the fact that probably traditional citation styles, as I've been doing them my whole life, and as they've been around for a couple hundred years actually, are probably not going to continue much. Hypertext is in our future, right? That's probably where things are going to go. There's going to be digital replacements for these. They're already ridiculous in the sense that a lot of traditional academic publishing will still use Latin abbreviations. After the first citation, it might say IBID, meaning the next footnote is the same as the one above it. That's a Latin abbreviation. Why are we doing that rather than copying and pasting the same footnote a second time? Because before word processing, it was a lot easier to type IBID and it saves space. That's still done in publishing because they're often saving space to make the book cheaper, because printing, pages and ink and shipping have all become a lot more expensive. So they're still trying to save space. But that's, of course, a barrier to people getting into comprehending an academic text, because, nobody learns Latin anymore. So that's all in the process of changing. And I didn't want this to go out of date overnight. So I've sort of taken a different approach to helping you to understand why and how these things work, how they function, and therefore you can adapt quickly to the new ways of doing things and still performing the appropriate function they need to perform ethically and practically to allow academic research to flourish. And then finally, the last chapter is the research essay. Now, this chapter, sure, similar to a lot of other books in the research essay, other than they tell you to be clear, and I show you how to actually be clear, what makes the difference between clarity and lack of clarity. But I build on all of the skills you've developed in the earlier part of your major and your gen ed classes, which are all covered earlier in the book and you can go back to and refer to, so that by the time you get to the research essay, you're not starting with a blank page and your only experience is write about a topic, which leads to that kind of book report problem, right? So that's all there. I think I got distracted, as I easily do, when I was talking about examples. In every one of these chapters, there's lots of examples. And I mentioned I didn't want examples of a sort of ideal type, because I didn't want you to copy stuff. I forgot to get around to what are the examples then, if they're not sort of the A essay to copy. I do have examples in here of high achieving essays, and those are actually taken from my students, from real ones. I also have mostly examples of not so successful bits and pieces of essays. Number one, I don't show a whole essay, because what are you supposed to do with that? But I show her the individual rhetorical moves. In other words, what is introducing an essay? What is stating a thesis? What is the goal of that particular move you're making in that particular sentence? What are the difficulties of it? What are the ways of achieving it? What are the tools you can have? And then I'll show several examples of a sort of one that's not achieving the goal at all, one that's kind of getting there but needs some work, and then we go through what would that work look like, what are the possibilities, right? And then several examples often of how it can actually be achieved in several different ways that are all equally successful, because they meet the goal. They meet the goal in ways specific to the student, right? Just want to mention that my bad examples are not, they're taken from some of my students' work. My students have been my guinea pigs for years, and I've asked them for permission to use their work, but I've never just given a straight up bad example of a student where they would recognize their own work. I alter details, and what I mostly do is cobble together bits and pieces from others, and I've just read so many thousands of essays. Some of these I can simply construct a not so successful answer out of my head because I've seen thousands of them. I can do it from memory. Anyway, so that's all what's covered in the book. It is for reference in the sense that when you get assigned a primary source essay, jump straight to that chapter. If when you're reading that chapter and you're working through it, there is an earlier, more basic skill that's super relevant to writing that kind of essay that was earlier in the book, there's a reference to tell you, if you need this, go to section number, and you can go right there, right? So it is constructed, and I did that, again, I had to fight with my editor for that, did that very purposely, so that the book would be fully functional to simply open straight to the chapter on the assignment you have in front of you right now. Often it's a primary source essay. And everything you need is in that chapter. If there are specific things you need somewhere else, it'll tell you exactly where to get it. There is also an index, so that if you're not given yet an assignment, like say a primary source essay, but you're told, do a course blog, or the word anachronism comes up. I'm just looking at things in the index. Or they keep talking about gender and it doesn't sound like what you understood gender to be. The academic meaning of gender is a socially constructed gender identities as opposed to biological sex. That distinction may not have been made clear to you before. These kinds of things that are in the book somewhere but are not like in the table of contents under a specific chapter, not obviously so, they're all in the index, which is at the very back. It's an alphabetical list, and if there's something you're wondering about in your class, it doesn't make sense, check here first. Chances are it's in there somewhere, if it's one of the things that is so consistently involved in doing history that you're going to come across it in more than one class. Now, if it's not that, it'd be subject specific to, say you're taking a course in the Russian Revolution, right? And it's something very specific, like a Russian word. Well, then you're going to use the other course resources you have that are specific to the subject, right? Or your professor. That was the other way to go. Okay, so I hope that's convinced you to open the book and to use it. I'm pretty confident that if you actually open it and try to use it, it's going to really, really help you out. But the barriers to make you actually open it up. If you can't afford or don't want to shell out $25 for this book, get it from your library. If it's not already in your library, put on reserve by your instructor, ask your library to acquire it. That is an absolutely fair thing to do. And certainly if a professor has assigned the book, the library should acquire a copy. Libraries' budgets are very crunched right now, but this is a very basic reference work that is relevant to the entire population of history majors. So it shouldn't be too much of a hard sell. And if your faculty in the history department have not already done that for you, you are absolutely someone who can go to a librarian and say, I would like to please request that this be purchased by the library, and then you can, hopefully they put it on the reserve so that more than one person can use it during the semester. You can take it out for, say, 2 hours at a time to go through the chapter on an assignment you have, right? So I hope that you do that, and I hope you learn a lot from the book and really enjoy it. If it's been helping for you, let me know. I would love to hear that, but I don't need to know. Please, I hope it's useful to you. That's all I really want from it, and thank you so much for listening.